We are continuing from Luke chapter 2, verse 21. Jesus presented in the temple. On the 8th day, when it was time to circumcise him, he was named Jesus, the name the angel had given him before he had been conceived. When the time of their purification according to the law of Moses had been completed, Joseph and Mary took him to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. As it is written in the law of the Lord, every firstborn male is to be consecrated to the Lord, and to offer a sacrifice in keeping what is said in the law of the Lord, a pair of doves or 2 young pigeons. Now there was a man in Jerusalem called Simeon, who was righteous and devout. He was waiting for the consolation of Israel, and the Holy Spirit was upon him. It had been revealed to him by the Holy Spirit that he would not die before he had seen the Lord's Christ. Moved by the Spirit, he went into the temple courts. When the parents brought in the child Jesus to do for him what the custom of the law required, Simeon took him in his arms and praised God, saying, Sovereign Lord, as you have promised, you now dismiss your servant in peace. For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the sight of all people, a light for revelation to the Gentiles and for glory to your people Israel. The child's father and mother marveled at what was said about him. Then Simeon blessed them and said to Mary his mother, This child is destined to cause the falling and rising of many in Israel, and to be a sign that will be spoken against, so that the thoughts of many hearts will be revealed, and a sword will pierce your own soul too. Let's stop over there, verse 35. So this is just, again, continuing the story of Jesus. It's the early stuff. There's not a lot of teaching going on, but there are still some exciting, interesting things to take out of this passage. The first one being just a continuation of the thread of God working through the traditions and customs of Israel in terms of Jesus being born and presenting him. And so he's being circumcised as had been set up, and kind of all fitting in with the law. And I think that's really rad. And I think also what it helps us to do a little bit, I think, is connect the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament, because often people feel like there's a disconnect between how God is described in the Old Testament and the New Testament, and it's almost like there's angry, violent God of the Old Testament, gracious, peace-loving God of the New Testament. And yet, a close reading of the Bible really shows you that it's the same God. And maybe he acts or behaves in different ways in a sense, but the same essence of love for his people, of wanting Israel to be a nation to bless all nations. And so this passage that connects Old Testament traditions with New Testament, the beginning of this New Testament, I think is really helpful in terms of just reminding us that there's one God. There's not two gods. It's not angry God, happy God. It's like this is the same God of the Old Testament and continuing the story that we've seen thus far. I love the story of Simeon, and I think Luke is the only of the 4 Gospels that mention this encounter with Simeon, and then later the next one we'll see is with Anna, the priestess. And this is just a case of God really just highlighting, like the Old Testament we see a lot of prophecy, and then here's an act of prophecy where Simeon has been told by the Holy Spirit that he's not going to die until he sees the Messiah. And so there's this very strong leading, and we don't know Simeon's story at all, but there's the sense that there's this old faithful man who's waiting to die in a sense. He's ready to die. He's lived a long life, but God has told him that the significant thing is going to happen, and that he's chosen in a sense to be a part of that. He's going to get to see it firsthand. And this was stuff. New Testament comes something like 400 years after the Old Testament. So people have been waiting a long time. So I imagine for Simeon holding on to the faith of, you're going to see the Messiah before you die. It's like, well, it's been really quiet for 400 years. So there's a huge act of faith. But just in this brief passage, it just seems to be such a strong belief. It's like, no, he knew it. Here it is. I'm ready to go. So just such a powerful piece. And then this is what he says. It is very interesting, which I only actually spotted now. I've probably read this passage a whole bunch of times. But he says, as you promised, you now dismiss your servant in peace. For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the sight of all people. So he's confessing, declaring that this is the salvation of God's people. But the first thing he says is a light for revelation to the Gentiles and for glory to your people Israel. So that's very interesting that already Simeon had it revealed to him that this is a light for revelation to the Gentiles. This thing isn't just for Israel. And it's quite interesting, like we don't see much more of the story. We don't know who Simeon is. We don't see like Mary and Joseph having conversations about this afterwards, but there are various points in the life of Jesus where people seem to think this is just for the Jews. And even in the book of Acts, there's a moment where it's dramatically revealed to Peter that this is for Gentiles as well. But it's so interesting to see that right from the start, the prophecy over him as a baby is like, this is the light for revelation to the Gentiles. This thing is not just for us. This thing is for everyone. And I wonder, this is a very dangerous statement, but I wonder if in the Old Testament, the Israelites were God's chosen people, but as we see, they were meant to be a blessing to all nations, so it wasn't just supposed to be all about them. But now, it's actually, this is for the Gentiles as well. This is for everyone. And whether the New Testament, whether Jesus and the disciples and Paul was a sense of just expanding this thing again, of making it not just about Israel. And if it is about all nations, and it is about everyone, then Israel maybe doesn't fall into that special category anymore. I can't pretend to know the politics of Israel and Palestine, but it's very interesting to me, almost like a faith boosting thing, that in world politics there's such a huge focus on Israel and Palestine, and it doesn't feel like it's by accident. Like in terms of just them as two different countries or two different peoples, the amount of focus and kind of centrality that they have to world politics feels huge. It feels out of proportion. If you understand it in the context of the Bible story and Israel's calling and all that kind of thing, then it makes a lot more sense. It makes a lot more sense that Israel has the eyes of the world on them. But this passage is Simeon saying, this thing isn't just for Israel. This is for everyone. And I think another lesson that we're going to see a lot more through Jesus is the sense of circles. So Jesus had his closest followers with him, and then there was the crowd, and then the circles kind of get bigger and bigger. But Jesus was constantly inviting people that were on the outskirts in. Whereas a lot of the time at the church, we like to put up boundaries, we like to put up doors, fences, and say, those people can't do this, those people aren't part of this, those people can't come in. And yet Jesus has this real inclusivity of saying, this is for everyone, come. There's a call, there's a cost, there's a sacrifice, there's a challenge. It's not come as you are and continue to be as you are. It's no one condemns you, go and sin no more. There's a calling, there's a life change, there's all that thing, but it's open to everyone. Jesus speaks to the Pharisees, to the Samaritan woman, to children. He's constantly inviting people in, and I think this is kind of a foreshadowing of that. But so rare to see it happening through the priest when Jesus is still just a baby. I think that's really powerful. And then a final little parting message to Mary, which I don't know if it's that cool for her. This child is destined to cause the falling and rising of many in Israel, and to be a sign that will be spoken against, so that the thoughts of many hearts will be revealed, and a sword will pierce your own soul too. And maybe that's a foreshadowing of when Jesus is going to be crucified, and just how dramatically that is going to affect Mary. But it must have been, like we saw in earlier passages, Mary pondered all these things. Like that must have been quite a hectic message for her to ponder. A sword will pierce your own soul too. So again, we're still dealing with the early parts, and it can feel boring in a sense. I saw like a chapter or two ahead, we've got a long list of names, and we're not going to skip those, even though I sit there going like, what's this about? But I think it's helpful that we embrace the whole story. And so when we start looking at Jesus and his life and his teachings, then these encounters with the shepherds and the angels and with Simeon and Anna in the temple, they all actually have created a foundation. They've created a bit of a framework, and stuff starts to become relevant. And I think we'll look back to some of the stuff and go, oh, wow, I can see that as well. But the big takeaway from today's passage is just this idea that this is going to be a light of revelation for the Gentiles as well. This is not something that is exclusive to Israel. This guy, this message, this kingdom is for everyone.